I think that this a problem which seems to me to be extremely important, and I think it's more important every day, is the problem of observation. Now, one reason why I think so is because I get so sick and tired of hearing about the various different schools of psychoanalysis and their great superiority to the other one, whichever it is. One of the reasons for this is because the possibility of arguing about the relative merits is simply endless. As long as you don't anchor any of it to facts, you can continue endlessly. But the other point about it is, I don't think I know of any scientific work unless it is based on observation. It's a great comfort in any case, because if you can base it on observation, then you have something to go on. Which is as near to facts as you're ever likely to get in this extraordinary subject. There's something which always strikes me as very curious. If an individual finds that he cannot see very clearly, then the chances are that he will use a stick. Now with his stick he waves it about, he prods the ground, and seems to rely upon it to give him information. Well, sticks, like any other inanimate object, don't give any information. The individual who's learning it, however, learns how to use the stick and appears to be able to diagnose or to interpret the information which he thinks he gets from striking other objects, or perhaps being able to feel that the ground that he is on is soft or sandy, whatever it is. Well, I wonder what kind of stick we use when we are concerned with what is supposed to be the human mind. That, to start off with, is an assumption. But what kind of a stick is that we use? What instrument that we use? In order to supply us with facts which we might be able to interpret and go on from that point. Psychoanalysis is alleged to be one of them. Of course, I went through the very considerable training courses, both in the old Tavistock and in the Institute of Psychoanalysis, learning more and more theories. But I didn't know what on earth else to do, except to learn these various theories which I understood one needed to know. But long after I had completed my training course, and I think begun to recover from that traumatic experience, I really thought that I began to get an impression about what it was all about. I don't think I'm satisfied yet as to what that impression was or how I gathered it. And that is one reason why I would like to continue debating the matter here, because you may be able to throw some light on the subject, and perhaps one could get some further clue about the whole thing. Namely this matter of what is it that one is observing.
You used the word mind just now. In some of your books, you rather prefer to use the term personality. And I'm very interested in that distinction for psychoanalysts to use.
It isn't really a distinction. It's due to the fact that I don't know what to call the thing. Sometimes I call it a personality, sometimes I say a character. But I really don't know what it is what to call it. Freud talks about an ego and an id and a superego. One's heard of soul, super soul, spirits. The French have a word, I don't know how to translate it, a sortilège, which I suspect comes very close to it. I said, I don't know how to translate it. That is the trouble. I haven't got any doubts about the existence of this affair, but what to call it, or what name to give it, even falling back on such English as I know, I really cannot think of a suitable term. I'm glad you asked the question, because it really goes straight to the root of the matter. But I still continue to feel that there is a character or a mind. Now, how is one to get anywhere whatsoever in the direction of what has so far been called a scientific view? Freud himself seemed to think that he was making a scientific approach to this question of human personality. There's a great build-up of psychoanalytic literature. And there's a still greater build-up of argumentation about these various theories. But the theories continue to be elaborated, and there continue to be people who think they've had an experience which they would like to communicate. Melanie Klein was one of them. Abraham was another. One knows many people who did. Steckel, Jung. Suppose one thought that music might be a way of exploring. It occurs to me as one of them because this is one human activity which plays a great part. Philosophy is another great activity. Mathematics is another one. I had occasion not so long ago to talk to some rather distressed parents and a very distressed analyst. Because the child in question could not learn mathematics. There didn't seem to be much the matter with the child, quite an intelligent child, but absolute BF when it came to a question of mathematics. Very puzzling. 2 and 2 equals 4. Yes? He couldn't understand that, but he was a good boy, and he could learn it by heart. So then he knew that 2 and 2 was 4, but he'd forgotten it the next day. Well, I had a little conference, and I asked the teacher, well, you must be able to hear what he says about this. Yes. So, can you tell me, what does he say that 2 and 2 does make? Obviously it doesn't make 4. Because that is something that he's picked up from you and from his school. And it means so little that he cannot really grasp what it does mean and forgets it. Well, it turned out that they did not know what 2 and 2 meant. So, well, I think that the only thing is you'd better listen to this boy doing mathematics and find out what his mathematics are and what 2 and 2 does add up to. It seems to me that if one could listen to that and find out a bit more about what it did mean, then one can fall back on a basis or a fund of knowledge. Because I've forgotten what it's like to be asked what 2 and 2 made, or divide 10 by 3 or 5 or something of that kind. But this small boy and from what they told me, he was obviously intelligent. He made remarks which were extremely acute. So there can't be anything wrong with his senses, what he hears, what he sees. So the information which his senses brings him doesn't seem to have anything wrong with it. Any more than one could say that if a blind man tripped up and fell over, there's something wrong with his stick. Other people have difficulty in learning how to play the piano. I was told by somebody that they simply couldn't make head or tail of it. They did their exercises and so forth, but they really couldn't get anywhere. But one day later, when they had children of their own, this particular person found that thanks to their continued exercise of the piano and so forth, they were absolutely first-rate wrist wrestlers. You know the kind of thing. You get hold of the other and try to put the hand back. So the muscular development at last had paid out. And you could at last see very good reason for all those weary years of musical lessons. It wasn't very long after this that this same person began to feel rather pleased that they had learnt the piano, because they got a certain pleasure out of the musical sounds that they were able to make. So there was some kind of expansion going on in their soul, mind, character, personality. Some sort of development which was taking place, which meant that this curious facility for playing the piano was conveying something to them which had now begun to have a meaning. It's something like that that I feel about this matter of psychoanalysis and characters and personalities. Even groups of people. Take for example, us here. I wonder why or how such a mass of diverse people come together at the same time and in the same place. Well, of course, that can be very easily explained. So easily that it's completely fallacious, and it's just one of these bits of knowledge which are a frightful nuisance. And indeed, the kind of work that I'm engaged in I feel that most people have reached an age where they have so much knowledge that they can't penetrate through to the wisdom. It's a new kind of forest. It's a new kind of forest which you can't see for the trees. You can't see the wisdom for the knowledge. It's peculiarly harassing to listen to somebody like that. It comes over, if you're listening to it, rather than this way. Yes, I know. Yes, I know. Yes. I mean to say, well, you know, well, what I mean is, and so on, ad infinitum. Slightly more harassing because it appears to be slightly more meaningful. Is the command of masses of psychoanalytic theories. The noise that those theories make is so great that you can hardly hear yourself think. It's one of these occasions where I think that it is useful to be able to shut off one's awareness of what's going on, so as to get the turmoil cut down enough for some relevant fact to be able to get through. Something which one could call evidence on which one might be able to base one's judgment. I find it useful and indeed I've passed it on to other people, that I think that the great advantage of individual analysis is that you've got the collaboration, if you're lucky, of the one person who really knows, and that is the patient. Because I think it is fairly easy to see that it's likely that the patient knows what he thinks, knows what he feels, and knows what it feels like to have a particular feeling. For example, patients say they feel terrible, or they're feeling anxious, and so on. I don't find that very illuminating, but I have felt the impulse to take it seriously. Because it seems to me that that's a sort of verbal formulation of what another person might say is that they've got a pain in their hand. It hurts. And if one was carrying out a physical examination, one could say, well, where's this pain? They show you the place in the hand where it hurts. And you can go on from there. Continue your examination. But the kind of people I'm talking about don't tell you that it hurts. They tell you that they are anxious or frightened. I've now been convinced that that is simply an approximation, an attempt to verbalize something which has not been verbalized yet, because that patient is suffering from pain. Now, falling back, as one has to, on ordinary speech, one has to say mental pain. I think it's a rotten expression. It's the best I can do. It may get a bit clearer later on as to why I don't think it's good enough. If the person in question was a painter, then they can employ various shades of color which are much more subtle. In fact, what they're doing there is really exploiting light. And that comes very near to becoming something which can be scientifically expressed in angstrom units and so forth. We're not so lucky to have anything so precise. One has to put up with words like anxious, or terrible, or frightened. Or sometimes I had a terrible night last night, but as a matter of fact, we had a very good evening indeed. And goes on from there. This last example is most deceptive because you are invited to pay no attention whatever to the fact that the patient has said they had a terrible feeling. Indeed, when a patient enters the consulting room, I do regard myself as fortunate because the patient is so cooperative as actually to have taken the trouble to get there and to present themselves. And I am lucky enough to have a chance to observe this person who is not me. Now, the communication, whether it's what I can see or whether it is what I can hear, presents me with what I now think of as mental debris. All this stuff, you know, that is accumulated between the time they were born and that particular morning. The stuff that they've learned in school, the stuff they've learned from their parents, the stuff that they've learned from their senses. I said between the time when they were born and now, but then I'm not sure about this matter of when they were born. Because I have no idea when the optic pits and the auditory pits become functional. I've never heard anybody offer any suggestions about that. But clearly at some stage, probably by the time that you get a full-term fetus, there is a development taking place which makes available to the embryo or the fetus what one day one could call sensations, feelings, thoughts and ideas and so on. Whether it is pressure on the optic pits of the amniotic fluid or waves which are produced, I don't know. But anyhow, I can see that in this sense, that the debris that I'm talking about can have or can be a very considerable collection. Well, one can watch the patient. You can see the patient lie right on the edge of the couch. One wonders why on earth he does that. Why not lie comfortably in the middle of it? why the patient doesn't say anything, or why the patient says, yes I know, and so on, ad infinitum. And why they say they have no imagination, and why they say they have dreams or don't have dreams, etc. But the point about it is this, that I think that one has to observe all of it. Just on the offhand, that somewhere amongst all this debris, there's a scrap of information which is important. I'm sorry not to be more precise than that. All I can say is that I still feel the need to be aware of this debris, not to allow myself to fall asleep or to miss too much of the possible chance of gathering information, in the hopes that in one's sieve-like mind, one will catch up here and there with a piece of knowledge which is quite useful. And doing this sort of work fairly continuously and for a long time, perhaps one gets a bit more sensitive to these bits of debris which are significant. One reason for it is that I find that the prospect of the patient coming to me for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years is somewhat unappealing. Especially when the patient seems to be perfectly satisfied with the experience and the life that they are leading, which appears to me to be disastrous. And yet, so much of medical practice, not just psychoanalytic, but all medical practice, all this practice which is intended to be helpful to the human being, seems to me to lack discrimination. As if one had no way of being selective and didn't know what to select. Unfortunately, I think it's true, one hasn't. I have a better idea now, on the whole, of what I am likely to select. And I have a pretty good idea, too, that since that is the case, I long to be able to say thus far and no further. What I don't know isn't knowledge. And simply getting ossified on that basis. Simply getting to a point where one's defenses, one's resistance to any further information will protect one from having to start thinking all over again. I try to resist that, and one way I try to resist it is by regarding the patient that I see at that session as an entirely new patient. And I think this isn't so very wild either. Because time has passed, and although you can't see time or feel it, I think it is fair to say that time has passed and people get older, so that the patient that you see is not the same patient as the one that you saw yesterday. And usually not the one that started speaking a sentence to you as the one that finishes it. It's rather a painful business because, in fact, I find that it's very hard to resist falling back on what one already knows about the patient and resisting, in fact, having to think afresh. Having to tackle the situation as it is, as an entirely new situation to which one has to bring a fresh mind. To sum up, I think that one is presented with the debris, with the vestiges of what was a patient once, and what still could be sifted in such a way which is analogous to blowing up the dying embers of a fire, so some spark communicates itself to others and you build up the fire again, although it appears to be nothing but dead ash. I'm making that pictorial image of it to give an idea of what I mean. Can one look at all this debris and detect in it some little spark still of life, which could then be fostered or developed in a way which could lead to rejuvenation, as we call it, of the whole personality. I think that something similar can be done with a group of people. It's very curious that if you take long intervals, that there seem to be certain curiously reminiscent features. For example, why does Newton engage on what I gather is a mathematical activity? And start talking about light. And why does he similarly seem to encroach on what would appear to be a theological investigation? Why does Descartes similarly find himself defending a theological position? The explanation that he gives of it is quite simple. He does not like what has happened to Galileo, and he doesn't want to get into the same difficulty. But his argument is not at all a good defense of that statement. In fact, it isn't a defense of it at all. It's quite clear that he is not, in fact, intimidated by what has happened to Galileo. Over and again, you get this curious business of an inquiry, of an investigation, and then the link up with what appears to be theological theories or ideas. Freud talks about the future of an illusion. I think that's quite a nice, interesting speculation. I would feel a bit happier if I knew which illusion. What future is it that one is investigating? Nowadays, unfortunately, the collection of debris is very much increased by the debris of psychoanalysis. I don't think that you hear quite so much about father figures and all that, but quite enough. Quite enough to get on with. Somewhere hidden amongst all this debris, you can get a glimpse of actual suffering. If you're an analyst, it's rather difficult because one gets almost hardened to human suffering, almost like becoming a sort of doctor or surgeon who is so used to having patients that he forgets that it hurts, and so used to hearing about anxiety and so forth, that one forgets that it hurts. So one has to beware of thinking that one is really hearing about the real thing, when what you're really hearing is the remnants of psychoanalysis. One cannot discard it on the grounds that it is simply a remnant, for the reasons I've already given. Therefore, you have to go through it all. Whatever you're feeling like, on the off chance that buried in this stuff, there is somewhere something that matters. And that comes very close to this question which was asked right at the beginning. Namely, what is this personality or mind or character? Can one narrow it down at all and to say what this is? Because if one could, then one might know what one was investigating and why we spend so much time and effort on this occupation. Of course, there again, there are plenty of reasons which can be very easily arrived at. But one still feels that there's a real reason. Although one has a good deal of evidence to suggest that we tend to follow the will of the wisp on the impression that it's real illumination, cure, a good time coming, heaven, hell, and so forth. So the seductive paths what Shakespeare calls the primrose path that leads to the everlasting bonfire, are plenty. Very attractive and perpetually urging one or seducing one in the wrong direction. This idea of a right direction is curiously robust. The Chinese call it the Tao, as far as I understand. Nearly all races and people have at one time or another stated that there is a way, a correct path. So that also, I think, is worth further investigation. When you get a view of it, perhaps by some patient who actually comes to you, shows signs of thinking that there is some direct path from which he or she has strayed. Whether one can get the same idea from a group of people, or even a nation, I don't know. You see, if you take this country, for example, at the present time, people wonder why it's in such difficulties. It seems to me that there are various somewhat obvious explanations of it, such as that if you go and fight two great wars in succession, and be the only country that fights through both of them, then you're sure to have to pay for it in some way or another afterwards. But it's typical of the kind of question which plagues us. And in fact, curiosity itself is a bit of a nuisance, because it doesn't let one rest. It always leads to one wanting to know more about something about which one knows nothing. Well, I think I would like to suggest that you widen this debate a bit. By raising any questions or giving any answers which occur to you, as being something that you would like to formulate.